So it's nice to know that both the recording is happening, but that we are also continuing to meet. I know it is a busy summer, so we'll get started right away with a bit of a brief recap of our last meeting. And if everybody recalls from our last meeting, that was the meeting where we got to look at the data dashboard and really take a look at the analytics that are available to us every day. And that we discussed working on incorporating those data analytics and that data conversation into the different workspaces that you all have in the different communities that you engage with. Part and parcel to that, actually, Lieutenant Governor Coleman, in the interim of our meetings, did see the North Carolina teacher workforce report. So North Carolina just did a recent effort similar to our effort. And so their data and their analysis and their goals related to next steps in their data are available on that report. So we'll share that report with all of you. But one of the things that we can do is actually take our own data dashboard and compare ourselves as a metric to what North Carolina did. So it's nice to have a partner state in looking at where they are in their conversation and just a little bit ahead of us and where we could be in comparison to them. So yet another comparison group for us to look at. We also talked through our aspiration statement, and everybody provided a great amount of feedback on what else we would like to see within that aspiration statement. And so I know Janae's been working on submitting that or revising that and really incorporating everyone's feedback into that. And so all of our ESG partners, so thank you for that. We've also solidified our challenges. We also broke into groups, and we broke everybody into groups based off of the categories of K-12, higher ed, and then community partners. And we did that because that seemed to be what was coming out of the workforce conversations as far as groups of people interested in how to manage educator preparation. And what we actually have since learned from all of that feedback, and what you'll see shift today from that work group meeting we had in May, is the idea that we're going to regroup into areas of recruit, train, and retrain. And so that actually was a function of the conversations that we all had within those groups. And there were themes that emerged from those particular conversations. So we're really excited to get started with all of that. And of course, today we have two amazing presentations that I just cannot wait for. We will have Dr. Lingo share with us some of the work that has been happening up in Louisville. And then we also have Dr. Chandler will be providing us the stakeholder feedback. So there's been just a massive effort to really get and engage the stakeholders of critical importance within this work. And so just a preemptive thank you to Dr. Chandler and her team for really running the gamut on that. And that, of course, would also include Doctors Ellis and Fraker, because you all just, you rallied the troops to get everybody's feedback, and that was terrific. So with that, that really sets us up for our first series of presentations. Does anybody have any thoughts or feedback or anything from the last meeting that they want to put on the table before we head into our efforts for today? Okay. Hearing none, then it sounds like we are going to do our presentation on preliminary findings. So, Dr. Chandler.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be back here with you all. So today I'm just going to share our initial findings or emerging recommendations from our stakeholder engagement, where we conducted interviews and focus groups with stakeholders across the state. So I'm going to go ahead and try to get my screen together for you. And I will say this again, like I say all the time, over a year of being remote, I'm still struggling. But okay, let's see, share screen. There we go. Okay, so across the 3 work groups, we conducted stakeholder interviews and focus groups. We used a mixture depending on who was available at the time. So we did individual interviews, small group focus groups with administrators, families, students, teachers and counselors. And we partnered with the 8 regional cooperatives across the region. And so those partners were really phenomenal in helping us with recruitment and, even filling in the gap when we were unavailable to conduct interviews. So I'm really excited about that. Each of the regional partners were very intentional about recruiting participants of color, individuals in rural communities and counties. And so we had a mix of participants and their perspective. Okay. So what we asked of the group, the groups who participated were around 3 areas: equipping students to successfully transition from high school to post-secondary. So in this theme of questions, our participants were asked about their outreach to families and communities, about their plans for transition into the workforce or to a college or a university, how they're communicating with families. We learned about a lot of technology that is being used, like Remind and social media. We talked about FAFSA initiatives. So topics of that nature were covered within that first bucket there. The second was around expanding equitable access and success in dual credit programs. So we did a lot of questioning on how are you recruiting, encouraging students to participate in AP, IB dual enrollment. We learned that, how families and students value dual credit, compared to other programs. We also learned about the types of students who are enrolling in the programs and what their perspectives were. And the last piece was building and sustaining a diverse educator workforce, which is our work group that I'm proud to be a part of. And this is where we asked about the challenges related to hiring and retaining teachers. We asked questions about training, what was beneficial for teachers and counselors, what they wish they had. And so today you'll hear a lot about the outcomes solely specific to that area. Oh crap, that's me, sorry. Okay, can you see my screen still? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So again, as I mentioned, we had representation from across the state. And so this just gives you a breakdown of how many participants we had and where they were located. So it was a good mixture across the state based on availability and the time of year that we're conducting these interviews and focus groups. And as you can see, the percent of students of color in schools and districts represented, there was 75% of public school students in Kentucky that do identify as white. And our percentage of students of color is significantly lower, obviously, because of the demographic of the state. Also, 61% of students that were represented based on the region and the districts present, 61% identified or would be classified as economically disadvantaged. And then last but not least, there was, so the schools that participated represented a range from 3 to 37 that offered, the schools represented offered dual credit or AP, IB offerings range from 3 to 37. So there was a wide range of schools that had, a few offerings here and there to full-blown programs for students to participate in. Okay, and so also, there we go. Also, we also communicated with post-secondary administrators and staff that range from all the way from presidents, provosts, financial aid coordinators, dual credit coordinators, as well as educated prep directors and deans also participated. And so this also gives you a glimpse of the institutions that were represented and participated in the study. All right, so to get into the good stuff. So what I have done was compiled the key themes that emerged from all of the data that we collected. This is, again, emerging themes that kind of were replicated throughout all of the interviews. So there might have been an instance where someone was really passionate about underwater basket weaving, but that was not the recurring message that I heard across the board. So you might not see something about that. So ultimately, the themes are going to be stacked by recruit, train, retain. I also included a component or a section around diversity and equity, just so that we can highlight some key pieces that were brought up throughout interviews and focus groups, but they all still fall under recruit, train, and retain, but just wanted to highlight them for the purposes of this group. Okay. So the first one was about perceptions of the profession. So a lot of teachers, administrators said, people just students don't want to be teachers anymore. We have families who don't want their students to become teachers because they see how much work teachers have to take on, as well as how little they're paid. And so pay and compensation also came out in every interview. It was like a universal notion that teachers need to be paid based on the amount of work that they're doing. One of the school counselors, as I said earlier, she said, students do not want to become teachers because they hear how much teachers do for so little pay. And then the teacher at a high school said, I didn't know for sure I wanted to go into teaching until I had the opportunity to go to a preschool and work there every day during first period. And so that leads into the comment that I have here about early exposure. So although individuals and families say, hey, we don't want to go into teaching, providing experience and exposure to allow them to see the value in the field, the flexibility that some indicated that they have, summers off and things like that. So just not just rebranding the profession and addressing pay, but also providing experiences for students to have early access and exposure to the field. The second piece, not the second, but the fourth item that came up a lot was the access to educator prep programs. A lot of individuals spoke on the admissions criteria related to testing, GPA requirements, and other hurdles that students might have to face. Another piece that came up around access to educator prep programs was the financial costs associated with testing, site visits, clinicals, all of those components. And so the need for scholarships came up a lot of how we can recruit students early. So expose them, help them get admitted, and then provide them with financial means to not only get admitted, but also to retain and be able to fulfill their requirements for graduation. And so one thing that was really interesting to me is a college dean said that what we need is for the state to send us funding that is earmarked specifically for educator preparation recruitment. If not, the university will use it for other needs. So not just dropping in buckets of money like this is to diversify student enrollment, at an institution, but really to say this is for teachers, this is for the College of Education to get more teachers in the door. So yeah, that was really interesting to me. So just to highlight a program that was mentioned throughout the interviews was related to the collaborative partnership that exists across the state, the Teaching and Learning Career Pathway Program, which provides high school students an opportunity to explore teaching the profession. They get to enroll in dual credit and get the early exposure of working in the classroom and to observe teachers. And so this was one of the bright spots that we wanted to highlight that was mentioned throughout the interviews. Okay, so for training and retaining, mentoring and support was huge. It came up almost often, and not almost often, almost always in every interview, but it was also always accompanied by the call out for the Kentucky Teacher Internship Program. And so folks really indicated how this program met a need and has now left a void because it's not funded. And so a lot of principals and teachers indicated that their local schools or districts have tried to replicate this program to some extent, but it's not fully sustainable, or it's not fully resourced for them to have the key players and training and structure that the KTIP had. And so, did I hear anything? Okay, so that came up quite a bit. And so I just really wanted to highlight that as well. But however, what I heard was KVEC, KVAC, and KDE have been really helpful with trying to fill gaps around professional development opportunities. School counselors also mentioned this as well, that they get to participate in professional development opportunities through these two organizations. Okay, a retention also included components of training around classroom management and pedagogy. A recurring theme for me during this process was hearing how a lot of our trainings are focused on standards and less on classroom management and effective teaching strategies. So for instance, some teachers indicated, that students are coming into school with new problems, new situations. After COVID, they've experienced things. And so how do we respond to the changing student and their family dynamics? And so more trainings around topics of that nature. Also, culture was a big thing. Some teachers said they felt like they were just talked at and they were not viewed as professional partners or collaborative partners when it came to decision-making practices. And so what we heard was a lot of dictation from individuals outside of the classroom without any teacher input. And so there was a call for a culture shift in relationship building amongst teachers and administration. So I want to highlight this quote from a student that we interviewed. He said, "What would entice me," and I put "to become a teacher, "would be the location, friendliness of the staff, and willingness to work with me and having teamwork." And what he was referring to was he saw how some of his good teachers were treated. And he was just like, I don't want any parts of that. But, if I had to be a teacher, this is what I would be looking for in the workplace. And so, again, we do want to highlight some good things that's happening. Shelby County Public Schools came up quite a bit, whether they were employed in Shelby County or they knew someone in Shelby County. They highlighted how Shelby County Teacher Internship Program supported teachers right out of college and provided them with a team of support that included administrators, a teacher mentor, as well as bringing back retired teachers to support new teachers as well. I believe this is also Shelby County that is assisting potential teachers with scholarships and access to dollars for testing as well. So that also came up too. Okay, so on the diversity and equity front, we had a conversation with a few African-American school social workers, teachers, school counselors, and they were able to provide some insight on their perspective as staff and teachers of color. One thing that came out across the board from our rural partners as well as white administrators as well was that a lot of our communities were not racially diverse. And so it makes their schools or their districts less attractive for individuals of color. But there's work to do in how you can get creative because diversity was important to them. So although that their communities weren't diverse, they still felt like it was important for them to have some representation at their schools. Racial bias in hiring came up quite a bit. Teachers of color noted that they witnessed or experienced racial bias in the hiring process. One quote that stood out to me that I want to share with the group is, I was invited to be on a hiring committee, and I can tell it was an afterthought because they already knew who they wanted to move forward. The candidates knew the committee. I was just there to check a box. And so this particular individual, what she described was the hiring committee definitely wanted to have a diverse candidate on the hiring committee, but it was like she was included at the last minute. You know, the applications were already reviewed, you know, and it was just a very awkward situation where she felt like her voice wouldn't matter. So I think that it's also important to note that people can feel when they're checking the box, and so to make sure that they're actually included in the process. On the flip side, a lot of teachers of color indicated that they're not getting interviews, and that there might be a bias when it comes to hiring individuals of color. So a quote from a school teacher really resonated that I wanted to share as well was, before moving to this district, I would always receive a pink slip. I got one right before tenure without explanation. It was stressful trying to figure out what to do next. And this particular teacher moved to a county that had an African-American male in a leadership position, and he fosters social support and networks across teachers of color within his area. And so that leads to another point of where teachers who may want to be in a predominantly white neighborhood for convenience or whatever, they said they just can't get interviews, but they can get interviews, or they're more likely to get interviews when individuals of color are a part of the hiring process. Also amongst that group, they said they would be gone if it was not for their peers in their community that keeps them coming back to the classroom. So again, that social support and networks was really a key retaining effort for them. And so some of the implications that we highlighted from the findings are as follows. What can we do to recruit educators, particularly educators of color? Obviously, we all know increase in pay and opportunities for advancement. That is a universal conversation that, you know, I don't think we need to harp on too much because we already know that. Also, leverage and clarify alternative pathways to certification for candidates with bachelor's degrees and current employees. We heard from a principal who said, you know, hey, there's a lot of grow your own from the high school perspective, but I grow my own from my school because these individuals have shown a commitment to the school and to the community. And so when I see talent, I try to foster that talent and encourage them to pursue a certification pathway. So that might be something worthwhile, is to highlight and clarify those pathways. Another potential approach is to require implicit bias training and cultural competency for hiring committees and supervisors. And that's not just for race and gender. A few spots, there were a few occasions where individuals said they were asked about various student situations that, you know, were unique. And so that they would need training, but also, you know, for the hiring committees to be mindful of their biases when interviewing or considering applicants from LGBTQ communities as well. Also, another approach was to extend the practice validity from 5 years to 10 years. Testing kept coming up, and I learned so much about the exams during this interview process. And so that was another one that came up that might be a good approach to look at. And last but not least, provide funding for testing waivers, scholarships to recruit future teachers, and to invest in other sustainable recruitment strategies. And the last piece I have here is centered around the training and retaining more teachers. And so again, one of the recommendations that kept coming up was to reinvest in the Kentucky Teacher Internship Program and providing mentoring and support for teachers of color, create advancement structures that provide opportunities for professional growth and salary increases, as well as providing recurring training for counselors and teachers on diversity, teaching practices, and classroom management. I do want to note that a lot of people indicated like their districts have early summer, late summer, early fall trainings around diversity. And they recommend having in-person, recurring, consistent training where teachers and counselors and administrators are bought into the process. A lot of them felt like they were open to it, but then it felt awkward because it was like on a computer and they can skip through. So just really making sure that trainings are intentional and very well thought out. People want to see the value added from their trainings if they're going to participate and use their time for it, is the message that I got. And then last but not least is to create a culture of support and collaboration that provides teachers with opportunities for input and feedback about potential changes. And as you can see, this is just a breakdown of how many people we spoke to throughout this process. It's 120 total. Okay, so we have about 15 minutes for just questions, discussion, anything you might want to add, just any reflections on what you just heard. And you can unmute when you're ready.
So what's resonating with me is when you talked about training and recruiting. A few months ago, I was asked to speak to Cohort at a university, and it was all white, all female, except for one guy who was a non-traditional student. And the first question I asked was, why teaching? And so many times I heard, besides the usual, I felt led to do this and I had a teacher who did this for me. What I kept hearing was, I want to work in those schools where I can just give these babies some joy, just give them something good. And, that kind of made me, because I knew what she was trying to say. So I pushed back. I said, well, what schools are you talking about and what's your motivation and what do you mean? Well, I've always wanted to work in a challenging school in some of those neighborhoods with those kids who just don't have any happiness. And when we're recruiting and when we're training, that's when that diversity, equity, and inclusion piece comes in, right? We have to make them understand that these kids don't need to be fixed and that anyone, regardless of their zip code, deserves a quality education. And you bring your best regardless, right? But those also are the same kids, those same students who don't end up in those schools. After a year, they're like, oh my God, I can't handle this. The parents are extra. These kids are too bad. And then they go to the nice, more affluent schools where they live out their careers, right? So when we talk about retaining, we talk about training. How do we impact them early enough so where this isn't so much of an issue?
Good point.
Penny, in that circumstance, how did your peer colleagues, your peer leaders who were also running this with you, how did they respond to that question or that conversation rather?
They deferred to me and made me do it. And it was okay because I have a daughter who's a teacher, right? And I know exactly when she decided she was going to be a teacher, and I know what teacher impacted her. And she's in a small county, it's a completely different mindset. But what I did was I spoke to them as a parent of color who's had to fight for my kids differently. And I gave scenarios, and the pushback, she was extremely uncomfortable. And I said, I'm making you uncomfortable. And I said, I would rather have you be uncomfortable now than before you go into a building and impact a kid negatively, right? So they let me handle it. And when I was done, she said, I get it. Now, it may not stick because that was just one conversation.
Right.
But more than one of them said, now I understand, because that question I asked was before the session. I had the director, I said, ask them this. So I was able to read them. And so many of them just wanted to change the world, make the world better, and help the little brown kids who just don't have any hope, right? And then the second thing, Dr. Chandler, was being in a community in the building, having colleagues that they could trust, and having an administrator who valued them and protected them.
Well, and one of the reasons I asked that question is because in some ways that was an opportunity because you were there, right? And so what happens when we don't have a parent of a child of color who's had those experiences to be able to explain that? We have to be able to prepare all levels of our recruiters, right? Whether it's a college dean or whether it is a community leader, to be able to have that conversation in a way that helps people understand that, because the circumstance, yeah. So it's just important that we expand the idea of training and recruiting beyond just the idea of who happens to be there in that moment, right?
I had a couple of things that I thought were really interesting, and thank you, Dr. Chandler, for your work, because that was a good presentation. So first of all, number one, the early exposure, I think is a point to definitely highlight, because the only real exposure, I guess, that students have is what they see in the teachers in the classrooms, or if they have a family member that is a teacher. And so not necessarily any kind of exposure of going into the classroom. So I think that early exposure experience is incredibly important, and that's a good piece. And also, as a former K-TIP mentor teacher, I remember that last year of me being in the classroom and not having K-TIP and seeing the new teachers coming in, and it was a huge hole. The new teachers just really didn't have anything to grasp onto, because they're just flailing in water trying to figure out what in the heck they're doing. So that K-TIP piece, I think, is a huge hole, and you highlighted that very well. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It was so much content. I tried to get as much as I could, but obviously, that was difficult. I think now we're going to hear from Dr. Lingo on some of the strategies that her department, her college is doing at the University of Louisville.
Yeah, and Dr. Chandler, I tell you, we could not have planned this better, because my presentation will really align well to your findings. So Natalie Hewlett is on here, and she's going to share her screen while I kind of talk to you, or I will talk to you about really a two-pronged approach that we're using here at the University of Louisville to diversify the teacher workforce. So Natalie, do you have?
I do not have access to screen sharing at the moment.
Okay, I think they're going to work on getting you that. Okay, you should have it now, Natalie. So Natalie, do you have it now?
I do, yes. Hang on, I'm trying to.
Okay, sorry.
Amy, I think you have the slides. Are you able to share? Mine is saying I need to quit before I'm able to share. Actually, wait a minute. Hang on. I may have lied.
There we go. Perfect.
Okay.
Nice.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
I'm telling you, as much as we do this.
Okay, and if you could, yeah, perfect. Okay, so we are going to talk, I am going to talk to you briefly just about this two-pronged approach of what we're doing here in the College of Education at the University of Louisville. So I'm currently the interim dean in the college, and prior to serving as the interim dean, I was the associate dean for academic affairs and unit effectiveness. So some of the work that we started back in 2016, I will also talk about through the teaching and learning pathway. So Natalie, you can move on to the next screen. So this two-pronged approach focuses, just as Dr. Chandler said, on traditional students. So those would be students who come to the university first-year students straight from high school, but we're also focusing on non-traditional students or adult learners. So those individuals that already have some type of bachelor's degree but have expressed some interest in teaching and getting them out into the teacher workforce. And so through a combination of both of these programs, we will talk about kind of what our ideas are about how to strengthen and enhance what we're currently doing. And so the first program that I'll talk to you about is the Louisville Teacher Residency Program. We just finished the first year of the residency program in collaboration with Jefferson County Public Schools. And the purpose and the goal of the program is to produce a diverse cadre of quality teachers. So the Louisville Teacher Residency, residents actually earn a salary through Jefferson County Public Schools. They are paired with a mentor teacher 4 days a week. And on the 5th day, they take coursework toward a Master's of Arts in Teaching degree. And at the end of that year, they do become certified, and they are committed to teach in accelerated improvement schools for 5 years in JCPS. The residency program was co-designed and is co-delivered between JCPS personnel and U of L personnel. So the university is the EPP that recommends the residents for certification. We deliver, they meet the academic degree requirements, but we also co-teach and co-design the coursework that residents are engaged in and with Jefferson County Public Schools. Jefferson County has invested a significant amount of money, not only in paying the residents' salaries, but in the mentoring and coaching and directing of the Louisville Teacher Residency Program. We have been able to secure some support through donors with regards to supporting scholarships for the Louisville Teacher Residents. So we also want to address the financial, as Dr. Chandler said, the financial support is needed and can often be a barrier for specifically non-traditional students as they seek an advanced degree and for their initial teacher certification. So this, again, we finished our first cohort of 29 students that graduated, and we just admitted our second cohort of 32 residents that will begin working in Jefferson County Public Schools in August, but they have started their coursework here at U of L in June. Right now, they're in their coursework. So that is the Louisville Teacher Residency for individuals that have a bachelor's degree. So the requirements of the Louisville Teacher Residency is the same as it would be for any other initial certification at the master's level. So there is a transcript review. They have the minimum GPA of a 2.75. There are prerequisite course requirements. Those are depending on what type of content area, if they're choosing a content area to teach in at middle school or high school. And there's also some prerequisite courses that are required for elementary education as well. They do have passing praxis. They have to have passing praxis case exam scores and content exam if that's applicable, if they're doing a middle school or a high school content area. There's an interview process and a combined orientation held between Jefferson County Public School and U of L. So those are the admissions requirements. The other approach is more for our traditional students, and Dr. Chandler mentioned this in her feedback, and it is around the teaching and learning career pathway. And we were one of the early universities that jumped on to the dual credit pathway in 2016, when the Kentucky Department of Education we were really trying to figure this out together around what the partnership would look like between KDE, a university, and a school district. And again, as Dr. Chandler alluded to, this pathway allows students to explore teaching as a career before they graduate from high school. So students can earn up to 9 credit hours in high school toward a bachelor's degree in education. And at U of L, that applies to whether you want to teach early childhood, elementary education, middle school education, or secondary education. The program provides opportunities for high school students to observe and work with students in classrooms, plan lessons, look and observe various teaching styles, think about how laws impact schools, how policies, and then we also put a very heavy emphasis on how to address the needs of diverse learners, and how we also work with our high school teachers and making sure that the curriculum that they are delivering is very closely aligned and mimics the curriculum that students would be getting if they took the course here at U of L. Obviously, it's been a great experience because not only I feel like that high school teachers have learned from university faculty, but our university faculty have learned so much from the high school teachers that are actually delivering that coursework. And so what I thought I would share with you today is kind of what our, Natalie, if you go on to the next slide. So as I said, they can take 9 credit hours, and it could be early childhood elementary education or middle and secondary education. But I think one of the things that I wanted this group to be aware of is kind of what population exists out there that are interested in pursuing teaching. And we know that with this pending teacher shortage, that I think universities and districts can partner together to not only address the teacher shortage, but to diversify the teacher, the workforce that will be out in schools. So currently, the University of Louisville is partnering with 11 school districts and 22 high schools. In the 21-22 school year, we had 276 total students that have been enrolled. So I think that this is a quote, again, not as rigorous study as what Dr. Chandler conducted, but I think this is an important quote, is that these experiences and these early experiences are really important for high school students, because it is making them or exposing them to teaching as a profession, and they are choosing teaching as a profession, and to pursue that in post-secondary. So, the thoughts were during the first class of the U of L Teaching and Learning Pathway, I was on the fence whether or not I wanted to become a teacher. After being introduced to teaching, by the middle of the second class, my mind had been made up. I love being in the classroom and work with students. This is the career I want to pursue, and I absolutely cannot wait. So I think that, as we become more enthusiastic about the profession, as we try to get in front of students to talk about what an impactful profession teaching is, I think we're going to have more students like Haley who decide to pursue teaching in post-secondary. And so if you will, go to the next one, Natalie. So you can see that in fall 17, we started out, we had fewer students that were enrolled in the pathway, but we had 95% of the students were white, and only 5% were students from diverse backgrounds. And so by spring of 2020, we had 72% of the students that were enrolled in the pathway were white, and 27% were students of color. So I think that this speaks to the way in which we can diversify the teacher workforce if we have a comprehensive approach for diversifying the teacher workforce. And so one of the things that what I'm interested in pursuing, I've been working with my assistant dean, Dr. Bridget Burpo, how do we strategically recruit high school students of color into teaching here at the University of Louisville. And so she had this idea, and again, it was not my idea, but it was, if you want to scroll to the next page, is that we think about preparing educators for community empowerment program. And so the purpose of this program is it would be a summer bridge program, and we would strategically recruit individuals between their junior year and senior year from across the state to think about, and they've expressed this interest of education through the teaching and learning pathway, and we will develop a system early on to help them see themselves in post-secondary settings. And so while doing this, we also want to increase the capacity of current educators and administrators with regards to equity, inclusion, and community empowerment. And so our idea, if you want to go to the next slide, is to think about this type of programming for high school students. So not only would they be taking the dual credit courses in the teaching and learning pathway, but in the summer, could they take additional dual credit courses from our colleagues in arts and sciences, focusing on mathematics, focusing on literature, focused on writing composition? What could that, so they would be here on campus for a period of time, so whether that would be 2 weeks in the summer, and then we would provide them with in-depth orientation around not only college in general, which summer bridge programs do, but also programs that focuses on really education and what an education major means. So they would meet current students, they would meet faculty, they would get comfortable on campus, tour campus. We would provide them with some upfront academic advising in addition to the regular university orientation. We would have program specific workshops for these individuals. So for example, time management, financial literacy support, other types of academic support that students may need. And then again, thinking about college readiness, those balancing academics, extracurriculars, and focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion topics, and really partnering with our colleagues in arts and sciences around diversity and what that looks like in schools and what that has looked like and what experiences have been lived with these students. And so again, our goal would be to narrow the performance gaps in college course completion between prepared students and underprepared students, because I think many of the students that we would be strategically recruiting may not even see themselves in college at all. So it would be a way in which we could select those students from that pathway so that they could see themselves in a university setting. And again, the goal would be to increase that first year to second year retention, which we know even our data at U of L, that first year to second year is when students tend to either switch majors, not sure that they want to persist in their given major. And so really thinking about how we can support them to increase that retention. And then again, I think our future directions would be is if we could take this model of the summer bridge program and link it from this teaching and learning pathway into what would a residency program look like for students at the bachelor's level. And if we're thinking about growing your own within Kentucky schools and districts, I think this would be an important way in which we could invest, specifically as we think about how do we diversify the workforce, because we know that they could become, with upwards of 30, maybe dual credit hours plus some AP credit. So could we front load that coursework to where they could spend a year taking some courses, but really engaging in a residency model? And so I know that was quick, but I did want to leave time for questions and to see if anyone had anything they would like to know more about what we're doing here at U of L.
Amy, can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges for the cohort students as they are working full-time and going to school
Yeah.
full-time?
Right. And I think this has been a really challenging year, right, for all of us. And I think, one of the biggest challenges was that many of the residents were admitted because ETS had shut down those testing sites. And so many of the residents were admitted without passing case exam scores, right? And so when that was extended, the residents maybe procrastinated in signing up for those tests. So that was probably the biggest challenge. The other big challenge was that between JCPS and U of L, we have certain assessment requirements like performance-based assessments in our courses that we have to adhere to for accreditation requirements. And then Jefferson County was adding additional assignments for the residents as part of their, so we really had to streamline and align the professional learning that we were providing at U of L related to standards, et cetera. And they had to adjust on their end as well. So the first year was challenging, but I think the lessons learned in our first year will only enhance us what we're doing going forward.
Was it hard to recruit into the program?
No. So we partnered with Simmons College to offer a pre-introductory to teaching, which is similar to, we based that off of the first course in the teaching and learning pathway. And someone from Simmons College taught that course, and getting students that were getting potential students that were showing some interest in teaching exposed, and was a huge recruitment for us as they came into the program. And I think there were even more applicants this year than they were in the previous year. And I will say, one of the challenges of the teaching and learning pathway is really around the equity of the tuition. Although, many of us will say, oh, the $153 or whatever it is per course, that's reasonable compared to, taking a 3 credit hour course at a university. But still, there is some equity issues, because even that $153, many students have a difficult time paying that, specifically in some of our the schools that we're working in. And so we've tried to figure out, how do we partner with the district? Can we provide some scholarships for students that are in that situation as well? But I think the summer bridge program is going to be a great idea, because we're going to be able to front load some of the academic support, and they're going to be exposed to some rigor of college coursework that otherwise they wouldn't have been able to be exposed to at the high school level here on campus in the summer.
That's great. Do you anticipate that it will be your faculty teaching?
No, I anticipate that I anticipate that it'll be some arts and sciences faculty that will be teaching, because
Okay.
I think that I think students, I know this is my experience here at U of L, students tend to do really well in education courses. I mean, not always, but where they really kind of run up against some obstacles is with our friends in arts and sciences who maybe don't have the background around teaching and pedagogy that we have. And so I would envision that in those dual credit courses in the summer, us partnering with them to deliver that coursework.
Just a clarification, I'm looking here at the CTE program of studies and the education pathway in that program of studies.
Mhm.
And normally with those, with the CTE pathway, there's an industry certification exam at the end. And I'm just clarifying that that the industry certification exam here would be the praxis. Is that the case, or is this a different kind of conversation?
So it's a different kind of, there's not a certificate, there's not an industry certification. Now there is an instructional assistant, right? Amanda, you might have to help me out on this. There's an instructional assistant certification that students could opt into, but it's not mandatory to complete the pathway.
Right.
That's correct. And Sherry, the difference on that is where they were talking about praxis before, that entry level praxis, it's been a conversation since its inception. And so they had worked really closely, KDE worked really closely with Educators Rising, that entire organization. And so they are still talking about it, but one of the things they have offered because of the industry cert is around certifying to be like a para-educator, is that entry level. And so they can certainly do that. But their big focus, their big carrot, honestly, is around the dual credit classes and earning credit for education courses. And so I think that was early on. I know they've talked about it more since it has become much more popular and aligned with the student organization of Educators Rising, and quite the participation and really the national competition that Kentucky hangs in very well. We've had national winners already in the first 3 years that we sent students to the national level. They won or were in the top 3, and KDE does a fantastic job of paying for their flight for the winners, the state winners, to participate. So I think that's really even elevated opportunities for students. So that has been the conversation, because it's not your typical certification, because you have to go to college and earn the bachelor's to earn that degree towards the career. And that's where we were always in flux, because it's not just a certificate. Like, we really want you to complete that career pathway, which is the bachelor's degree, to get the teaching teaching license and the degree. And so that's why there was the dual credit piece, but it is still discussed. And of course, there's new leadership in there now, so I'm not sure where they are. And Ellie's not on today, or we could ask her the update.
Thank you for that clarification.
Well, thank you all so much for letting me present and for your time. I'm happy to answer. Please email me with any questions that you may have. I could talk about both of these programs all day. So please let me know if you have any additional questions. Thank you.
Well, Amy, I will say as a fellow dean and working with universities, the partnerships that you all have described and really secured to make this work. I think that investment from multiple sides, both our community, the school districts, and the university side, that's really what moves this conversation forward. And I'm happy to see that also reflected in the makeup of our work groups, right? So over the next couple of weeks, or over the next couple of meetings, we will hear from some of the other universities within the Commonwealth as well, to hear what they are doing to address diversity and recruitment within the workforce. I do love whatever dean told you, Dr. Chandler, that we need specific funding that is earmarked to the universities, so that friends like Ginny and Amy and I do not have to go in and say, no, stop. It would just be a much easier conversation if we fully recognized and articulated in that funding source that the purpose of this is both recruitment into teaching, recruitment into areas of shortage, and also recruitment into diversifying our workforce in a way that really reflects our Commonwealth's values and goals. So.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you, Amy. And I know prepping those things. Wait, Amy, are you part of this group, or are you just visiting? I can't even keep track.
I'm just visiting.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Well, thank you for visiting us today.
Okay. All right.
We'll be in touch. Don't worry.
Awesome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Take care. That's hysterical. I was like, oh, Amy's here. That's just natural part of the group. Very good. Okay. So, so we heard from our two presentations. We are going to go into a conversation now about the emerging recommendations. And I've lost my navigator sheet. Who's leading that? Am I leading that?
You are leading recruitment, and I think I'm doing train and retain.
Okay.
I also
So-
dropped the recommendations from the last meeting in the chat for everyone as well.
Perfect. Very good. So we'll break into these groups. I think everybody just sit tight. If it asks you to join something, just say yes.
Okay, so when we look at, I may have been one that said that, when we look at the May notes, talks about how our students, students are not trained to educate diverse learners. I want to go back to something that you brought up in the findings, and that is classroom management. We know for a fact that certain kids are treated differently because either the teachers are intimidated or they assume that the behavior is so off the wall, you know, fill in whatever. So that's not a PD, right? That has to be embedded in that teacher education program. So when we talk about our charge and we talk about, does this match up? When we talk about your findings, talk about classroom management, this goes back to what we discussed in May about biases in teaching.
Penny, I learned an example of a student being expelled. So about a bias and difference of culture and all of that.
Yes,
so
ma'am.
That definitely,
Yeah.
yeah, that definitely makes
Yeah.
sense.
Well, that speaks right to the pipeline, right?
Mhm.
And that's how the pipeline stays alive.
Mhm. It's a great addition. Anyone else? Okay. And we can always come back to it. So if something comes up and you're like, hey, this is missing after we go through the discussion, just let me and Jennifer know and we can jot it down. So out of everything that we talked about, from the recommendations, the stakeholder engagement, what we really want to know is how should the continuum prioritize this work? So the findings and recommendations, and why. So we have to take these emerging recommendations to the continuum in a few weeks. And so what should be our focus? There's so much here. So how would you prioritize the outcomes of this work? And again, the prioritization of like the training and retaining pieces.
Okay, well, I'll talk. It's difficult to prioritize, isn't it? How many buckets feed into, go back, come from that larger bucket that we have. So, and we prioritize, I think it has to go back into training the trainers, right? So at the college level, when you have these teachers, when you have these students going through these education programs, are the ones who are teaching them aware? Have they been trained, right? So we can talk about recruiting and catching them as early as possible, but once they get into that program, are they getting the information that they need? Are they getting the quality education? And are they getting a well-rounded, more holistic education so that they can meet the needs of every child in the classroom?
Penny, I'm going to agree. I'm going to agree with that because I think we've got to start there and then make the circle back. Once you get the trainers trained and they're looking at that student and meeting the needs of that student, then we're releasing them future teachers who can go back and hopefully help change the culture at their respective schools. And yes, we still need to worry about recruiting, but we've got to get something to work with first.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I would throw out something to think about is which struck me in some of the things I've heard today is that it is the ideology of the staff, those that are doing the hiring, their ideas of what is an ideal teacher or what makes an ideal teacher or what would be a good fit for their school. And y'all can't see my quotation fingers, fit for their school. So I'm very concerned about kind of addressing that side of it as well. I know our teachers need to, to have that train the trainer competency as well, but I'm really concerned about those that are making decisions and what needs to be done to kind of facilitate that discussion and moving some recommendations for that.
Absolutely. And I brought it up last time and I will continue to, while I am a staunch supporter of SBDM, right? Because every school has the right to hire who they want. You have this pool that's sent from your district, from HR. But what happens in that building? What happens with that hiring committee, with that principal who decides who deserves an interview? How do we impact that? How do we mitigate that? Do we put in parameters where you have to have a minimum number of candidates of color, not necessarily of color? We're not talking, this is not a black-white issue, right? Mm-hmm. So what does that do? Because that does speak to the climate of the building and this perceived feeling or desire that this principal has as far as what she wants her staff and faculty to look like.
Well, Penny, I'm just gonna, I'll say this, so we're sort of in Vegas on this. So, but we've just been through part of that with Paducah Middle School and the hiring of a new principal there, and not wanting the superintendent to have a great input, and the community led that charge. And I think that's probably is going to set the tone for site-based management as decision make as we move forward, and not just for Paducah City Schools, but even now as one of our private schools is looking for to replace some leaders. There's that conversation going on about making sure that we have a diverse applicant pool.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Jessica wrote in the chat along the same lines. It might be beneficial to add something pertaining to search committees or maybe shared governance, for lack of a better term. I realize search committees fall under recruitment, but could also be a retention issue. I had a similar experience to the shared testimony about checking a diversity box when the committee already had their minds made up about a candidate. It is off-putting. It is definitely a retention tool as well. I think I mentioned how a number of teachers of color said, they would get a pink slip and then their job would be posted. And so they would be confused as to why they weren't being retained or, so I think it is not only just a recruitment tool, but also a part of the retention piece. So thank you for adding that, Jennifer. And thank you for sharing your thoughts, Jessica. Is there anything else that we should really, aside from prioritize, like anything that we really should highlight in our presentation to the continuum, or whether it's around the findings, the recommendations, the process of this work?
I have a question, and and I come from the health equity, not the education equity side, but I deal with not just equity from the health lens, but also upstream with the racial equity and systemic things and institutional things as well. But just a question I have is there a metric, and I do data by every day, is there some type of metric or some type of rubric that we could use to hold folks accountable in some way to where that it's that lens is focused on your school or on your recruitment efforts, or that's tied to something? I don't know if there's something that exists already. So I apologize if I'm not knowing what's out there already, to kind of put a hard measure or a hard and fast metric that has to be adhered to, other than something HR would say. Yeah, I know what the standard language says. We have to, not discriminate based on, we want to hire and be diverse and inclusive, and we don't discriminate based on race, as I know the EEO statement. But is there anything else that we could hold folks accountable to?
So like an accountability metric?
Exactly. Is there something like that, or am I thinking too long-term, too abstract, too far down the road, or
too practical? Sorry.
Sophie, go ahead. Sophie, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I really love that idea, because one of the things that I've been thinking about when we've been talking about this is like long-term efforts, because like a lot of this is like, when a position's available, this needs to be something that's taken into account. But like having some sort of like metric or something where we're holding schools accountable even past that initial hiring position, because like a lot of times, at least from what I've seen in like my districts and my schools, a teacher of color has been able to be hired, but then they very quickly leave because they don't want to stay, because it's not a welcoming community, or the school culture isn't doing anything past that initial hiring to promote any sort of equity and inclusion in their schools. And having something to like keep that going, and making sure that it's not just when you're hiring or that initial kind of recruitment that you're getting people to stay, because you're keeping up with that. And I like that idea of having that metric as a way of holding schools accountable to keep them going, to make sure that teachers of color want to stay in schools and they feel welcomed and they feel like they weren't just like a hire to check off a box. So that was just kind of running through my head.
Vivian, does that align? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Janae.
I just want to make sure we captured.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
perfect. On the same page, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, go ahead, Penny.
So climate audits used to be a thing.
Oh, okay.
I don't know that they do, and part of the issue was a lot of the climate audits were called for by the administrator in the building. But what if the administrator in the building is the issue? So do we bring back climate audits? Do we have someone in place at the district level to call for based on complaints, based on concerns by staff? So a climate audit is something that could be useful. I just don't know how prevalent it is anymore.
I like that though. I like the
Yeah.
climate audit. I like that.
Yep.
So Penny, I heard you say a climate audit, but also to look at how they're requested and handled, right?
Right. If you have an insightful administrator and leader in the building, you know what? There's something going on here. Our morale's not where it needs to be, and they would call for that audit. But who else can call for it? If it's just based on the administration, and that may be part of the problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these used to be handled by the EPSB. And I think, I know that they had some reporting issues. I want to say it was last year, maybe it was due to COVID, but they had been occurring. But to your point, they still do have local administrator involvement. So I definitely think that's something to address. And I was trying to do a quick search while I was taking notes too. There is reporting on like the demographics and hiring and retaining. EPSB does do reporting. I don't know what happens to that reporting. I know it's tied to title funding, but
Yeah.
I think you're onto something. If there was some way to use that in accountability or otherwise, that might be the key, is what do we do with that reporting?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's awesome.
And that might be something, definitely Penny, from your standpoint as a parent or a community member, as you're mentioning, Vivian, like those are things I would want to see moving into a community. What is my educator work look like?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. These were all great ideas. This is a great working group. I appreciate all the input. So for our last 5 minutes, we kind of just want to see if there's anything that's still lingering that we probably need to address. So, what questions do you still have? What more do we want to learn out of this work? And what more do we need to know? So like this accountability thing was a key thing. We need to know how that exists and how it operates.
We already have the data on retention rates for students of color in those first 2 years of education programs? Because I'm curious what makes them leave. Sophie talked about once they're in the building and why they don't stay, but what makes them leave the actual programs?
Right.
That's something we'll note down to see. I feel like it might be in that data portal, but let us jot it down and we can make sure we find out if we have it or if we need to explore that more.
I know somebody said that it was potentially linked to like title funding with like the accountability measure, but are there like other like well-known incentives or like grant programs that schools can get for trying to reach out, or like programs to bring more people other than like Kate and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about something else is maybe connect, and I like the idea of incentives, and maybe connecting those incentives to an existing pipeline program, and that makes that school at least have that relationship before this teacher gets there, so that teacher could that relationship could be building, that we could be building upon that relationship earlier than when they walk in the door first day teaching, right? So while they're matriculating in school, maybe that identified school that's kind of been our what's the word I'm looking for? It's kind of been our model school that's done everything right, that's got things in place, that has a grant opportunity or something else to kind of be a feeder for those new teachers coming out to when they go through the door, there's a relationship already established. And I know there's one when you do your student teaching and, but that's not time to me. I mean, that's not, that's to me, having my mother as an educator, that was more of a, you get in and get that done and pray you get through and you don't, don't lose your head, that's not the time for really that. But maybe we can, I don't know. I like the idea of building a relationship prior to having that person show up. And how could that be done? Right? So I don't know. I'm putting myself in that situation. I would want that, I think, right? That would make me feel that I was wanted, that I, was walking into an environment that valued me, right? Had been a part of my, mentoring and training. I don't know.
So Penny, I'm going to go back because, this is my 35th year at West Kentucky Community Technical College. And when I was hired, I was a former student at Paducah Community College, and then I was hired. But so I already had some connection with several different people. But one of the things that meant a lot to me is after the division knew I was hired, they sort of did a welcoming shower for me, and provided me with not just things for my office, but, a first aid kit and then the resource manual on who to call for what and that sort of thing. So it's like the welcome wagon, but earlier.
Right. Yeah. Making you feel wanted.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. As soon as you
Yes.
express, when, even while you're doing this, your student teaching, can that take place during that experience? Yes, you're a student teacher. Yes, you're there. But if that district really wants to keep you, maybe, what are some of the things they could be doing at that point in time to encourage you to apply for a full-time position?
Right. And I equate that to any job. You want to, at any opportunity where you've had to do an internship or a practicum for an employer, and you want, it makes you feel good when they say, we're watching you when you graduate. There's a place for you here. I mean, there's nothing that beats that to me. That confirmation that you have done something right, that you're in it for the right reasons. They recognize you as a value added, right? Something value added to the work. So I don't know.
Awesome. That was great. Just a part of, it seems like it's a part of the culture shift in general, from start to finish. So Sophie, I want to make sure I didn't, were you able to contribute? I think you did, yeah. Jessica, let us know if you have anything else while we're in here. We're going to resume with the main group in about 3 minutes. I believe we're going to share out. So we'll have an open group discussion, but we will share out about some of the things that we talked about. Can I get volunteers from this group to be able to share out when we get into the main group? I don't want to be the main person sharing out all of your ideas. I was looking for Penny's microphone to come off.
Bless your
That sounds like
heart.
a good person to me.
At least it's Sophie to say, yes, no problem. We'll report out to the group.
It's fine. Just back me up.
You're fine.
I just wanted to say how I appreciate this group. I really do. I've learned a lot.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Awesome. So I'm just going to pause. And so if you all need to stretch or take a bio break real quick, we're going to resume at 12:30, have 3 minutes.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to go check on new student orientation because we're getting to do it face to face today.
Oh, wow. We've been open here in the Sunshine State. So every time I hear someone says face to face, I get really excited for them. Oh, there we go.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Is everybody back? I think everybody's back. It looks like that. So, Jim, I have a follow-up question that I just want you to think about, and as we wrapped up the last conversation, which was, have we done that? Have we looked at the policies that are contrary to some of the efforts? And I don't know if that answer to that question, but policy's your gig. So just think about that. So welcome back. Hopefully everybody had a good conversation. I know that those were a fair number of questions to get to in analyzing some of the recommendations. So as this is a continuous work group, feel free to make sure that you are continuing to share your responses with respect to the prompt questions and the emerging recommendations that everybody took a look at for recruiting, retaining, and training. Moving on, we're going to now talk as a group and really get a brief breakout, share from each group, see how your conversations went. And if you could focus on those conversations on if you found anything missing, if you found strongly within your group that you wanted to prioritize certain things. And then we will move into who should own and take responsibility for these recommendations, because as they teach you in CPR class, if you just say out loud, call 911, no one will call 911. And we have data to suggest that. But if you identify who should call 911, then 911 will get called. So we'll add some ownership to these recommendations. And then we'll solidify our priorities for what we want to share with the continuum at the next meeting, which is actually next week. That is a crazy timeline. So since I was not in the retaining and training group, why don't you, who wants to share from that group? Clearly, we did not identify who was going to share.
We identified multiple. They're just being shy.
Janae, can you share, or is that, because I don't want to miss anything.
Oh, okay. Let me figure
if not, I'll try to use my brain. I'll just call on you guys a lot.
Well, I'm Zoom special. I'll try. Okay, here we go. There you go.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so we had a lot of questions. We talked about prioritizing, and we talked about how some of what we discussed today relates to the findings from May. And one of the biggest takeaways for me in the May meeting was that teacher candidates are not trained for diverse student populations. And I went specifically to classroom management because that was something in Dr. Chandler's data. She talked about classroom management how we know that there's a bias in terms of how kids are disciplined. So, and it's not just about getting in trouble. Daily, normal, run-of-the-mill classroom management is not taught in a culturally responsive way, right? So if that were the case, you would not have the disproportionate number of certain kids being suspended, sent to safe, expelled, however, whichever situation. So that was something that we talked about. And in terms of the prioritizations, there's a lot of those. We talked about training the trainers, and that's having the faculty being trained on how to prepare teacher candidates in a more holistic method so that they can eliminate and mitigate those biases, because we all come to the table with them. It's just a matter of how we relate to them, and how if we don't acknowledge them, we automatically have a problem. So training the trainers, are the teachers or the professors who are teaching these students, are they checking their biases at the door? Are they prepared to be able to understand what culturally responsive teaching is, right? So what they're giving them, what they're pouring into those students is what those students are going to pour into the classroom. Recruiting is still more important, but training that we have is the first priority. Lisa, was that you that talked about training, about recruiting and training?
Yes, it was.
Go ahead.
Yes. So it's important to have those individuals that can be the trainer, if you want it to say it like that. But also, we can't put, maybe I'm trying to say, you can't put the cart before the horse. We've got to have the pipeline going so that then we can hire those individuals who have been trained with that classroom management style and other things, and then move into the recruiting of additional teachers as we go through the process.
Mm-hmm. Right. We also talked about the ideology of school staff. What is a good fit for their school? And that needs to be addressed. And I brought that up. We're talking about SBDM. We're talking about how teachers of color feel that they aren't being hired. They're not even getting the interview. How much of that falls on SBDM, right? The administrator has a wish list of those he or she would like to hire. So that search committee doesn't necessarily have access. HR sends you a pool, but the school, that SBDM, that search committee determines who gets that interview. So that's always been an issue for me. I'm a full supporter of SBDM, but I think that that's a silo. So how do we address that? Diverse application pools are critical and have community buy-in. Search committees are shared governance in terms of recruitment and retention. I had a similar experience to the shared testimony about checking diversity. Was that Jessica, Dr. Chandler, and she had to leave? Was that Jessica who said that?
Yes.
Okay. Right. Metrics. Okay, so Vivian, this is where we're talking about the metrics and reporting and your desire to have that.
Trying to find my mute. Yes, Penny.
Go ahead.
So I deal with data all the time, and always looking on how to improve data and how to use that data, leverage it, how to have it speak to what you want it to accomplish. So I was asking if there's some kind of metric or something that we could put into the process of hiring and retaining our candidates, and then make that school accountable. How do we assess whether that school, that administration is doing a great job in the retention and the recruitment, and then working with those teachers that are coming in to make them want to stay? And do we build incentives into that metric? Is there some way that we can use those schools that meet that metric or that rubric as our model schools? And can there be something developed out of that kind of gives us a benchmark, to gives us something to aspire to? And then I think when we were talking about metrics, Penny talked about the climate audits, which I wasn't aware of. That's kind of something that kind of, when you develop those metrics, if you're not meeting those, then that's when that could come into place and say, okay, we've set up these things, we've set up kind of this rubric, this metric, this way to hold you accountable, but you're not meeting those. So what needs to happen now? There needs to be something to kind of force and I hate this word, force the hand, right?
Mm-hmm.
those that are, making decisions. So turn it back to you, Penny.
Excellent. Thank you, ma'am. So I'm going to bypass climate audits because you brought it up. Unless Dr. Fraker, you mentioned EPSB. Do you want to expound on that any at all in terms of climate audits?
Yes, and Amanda could actually probably talk to this a little bit better. And I know that this has been done in the past, and I don't know that it was done last year due to COVID, but certainly having EPSB and KDE continue with the climate audits, although some kind of, there was some conversation around what our school administrators' role is in these audits and how do we make the audits more inclusive or more inviting for everyone to give really candid input. Just how to make it more robust, I guess, in terms of our outcomes. And what do we do with that information?
Right. Yes, ma'am. And finally, we talked about what incentives or grant programs are available to bring more diverse teachers into the field, into the district. How to connect these incentives to existing pipelines, building on those relationships that are already there, and really making them feel welcome and wanting to be there. And that goes to the final point, which is how do we make our incoming pre-service teachers more welcome as they enter and consider applying for a full-time position, recognizing that those individuals and the value that they have, and having a culture shift, not a pivot, but a shift in this case, in going from start to finish. And I think that's it.
That's very robust. I cannot wait to have the debate around recruiting versus training and how we manage that whole situation. So that's great. Thank you for reporting out there, Penny. And sounds like you all had a terrific, robust conversation around that. Amanda, might I tap you to report out on us since you were note-taking and listening?
Sure.
Thanks.
And if there's something I miss, you all please let me know.
Yeah.
So just initially, we did talk really briefly just about what our group was pleased with and just their initial reaction to the report. Janae, you and your team got lots of props on the quantitative and qualitative approach to this data and how the stakeholder feedback was really presented very well to hear stories. And that was one of the desires of the Continuum, is to really tap into those voices. And so we're grateful for that. There's also excitement around the elevated need for K-TIP to return. We did talk a lot about that. Really, some of our members were really pleased to see that it was elevated and that there's some talk within the legislature around this. And that we know that districts are making great efforts with their own funds. Dr. Flynn, of course, mentioned it's nice to have the federal funds right now, but that's not long-term. And so that was something that was brought up as a yay. Another one was really getting more traction with giving teachers and folks more voice in their districts with decisions that occur, and working with administrators around that to make them feel like that there's a vested interest, not just feeling, but that they are a vested interest in their district and the work that goes on, and that those voices are valued. Also, that we are not communicating our pathways well enough. In education, we talk a lot about teachers and administrators. We don't talk about policies. We don't talk about at the state and federal level, higher ed, different pathways in education, that it is not only one thing. There's multiple facets in education, and we have to improve our communication. That really stuck out. Getting more folks involved in the teaching and learning pathway. How can we start earlier? Folks were really encouraged about excuse me, our strength around the teacher leader pathway. I could not agree more. And we've really seen a lot of interest. So it's really making it accessible and increasing the number that are offered. But folks really felt like that was a great avenue, and you'll hear this come back up again in a second. And the other comment that was made is that it's just refreshing to see that the recommendations of the stakeholders and their conversations are aligned with the emerging recommendations of this work group, and that there are these common things. It's not going in two different directions. And so although some may seem difficult or not sure how to address it, it is common, and we're seeing the same things bubble up. So that's encouraging when it's a unified issue that we can address. So some of the things around the feedback, around the recommendations, excuse me, is if we are going to really talk around funding support, which is similar to what Penny had talked about, we need to know what we're talking about. So when we talked about the support or scholarships around the cost of praxis or any of their exams, the cost of going to their placements for student teaching, whatever that is, what are we talking? Are we talking millions and millions of dollars? Are we talking a small sum? We really need to have more data on really what is that need. And the conversation that was brought up was around that there's some changes going on with EPSB around the requirements. Not that it's going away, but they have some different caveats. And then with the pandemic, waiving the initial praxis has also would probably influence the data. So we can definitely reach out to EPSB on that, and OLE or not OCL, excuse me. So one of the offices at KDE to help out with that. The other thing we talked about is it was brought up as a lack of flexibility in what to teach, that it was so streamlined that can be a turnoff. And so what we got to the point of was talking about communication, because some of the things that we do, whether we like it or not, is related to what's required for federal funding. We rely on that in Kentucky, but we know that sometimes it can overpower what goes on day to day. So that was a great conversation around how do we communicate what's a district decision and a state and federal, and what autonomy teachers really do have in their districts, and quite frankly, what they don't, and the why. We're not sure that that's ever really shared. And so sometimes that can even relate to the frustration or the sense of feeling overwhelmed to meet that test score or whatever, when folks don't have the full picture to really understand what flexibilities they do have. And we know that that looks a little different by district. So really communicating the autonomy and how things are made, how decisions are made. And then we know that that's what we talked about is what students observe as students with the teacher's fatigue, overwhelmed, and how we sometimes are our worst enemies on the field, because we talked about everybody's an expert in education because they sat in the seats for 12 plus years. And so they clearly know everything that's going on. But really it's up to us in the field, and it's up to the teachers in the classroom and the administrators to really change that story. It is a hard profession. It's not easy, but how do we really build it out as a career that is worthy? And it is extremely rewarding, extremely hard, but rewarding. And so how do we use our teachers who advocate for that and to really sell that message and rebrand how we talk about the education field? And so that was brought back up, as I said before, in really using that teacher leader pathway with the teachers who can teach that. They have to have a master's who can teach those dual credit courses and really be honest, but also be proactive in how we recruit folks into our field. And talk about leveraging current teachers to recruit the next generation of teachers. And absolutely, it's so important. We also, and we also said that successful retainment of keeping your teachers engaged and a positive culture for them to work in directly impacts recruitment. And we know that. So really, if you have a recruitment issue, you have a bigger retainment issue. And so priorities is what they talked about is really need to prioritize the funding we're asking for in policies. And one of the last comments that were made right before we got lifted back into the whole group was around what policies currently conflict with what we need to achieve or want to achieve. And I think that is a huge question and a great point that's brought up. And so I really wish Ellie could have been on the call today, Ellie Gilbert, who is the KDE rep. She can share some of the work that's going on, even Penny, with your conversation around SBDM with administrators and their work around being human capital managers, as far as being aware of their bias, and even human resource officers at the central office sometimes can be a barrier. Not intentional sometimes intentional, and really working with those districts at different levels to build capacity on that. And that's been work that's been going on for a while with the P3 work, but I don't want to take up more time with that. But there is work starting there, and a few districts have had a deep dive with the Human Capital Alliance that works specifically with those strategies. So I just wanted to bring that up because I hate that she's not on today, because she could have shared the updates with that. But Corinne, that is where we are on how far we got today.
So feedback from our partner group on what you heard that came out of our group. Okay. So let's then move forward to some of our very specific tasks, because I want to make sure we have 8 minutes left to get to our very specific tasks. If everybody were okay with it, perhaps what we do is we work through this list by assigning what we would recommend as the governing group for that particular recommendation. We'll do that first, and then we will, and we'll try to do that, I think, quickly. And then we will prioritize. So, because I think the priority could probably overtake the 8 minutes. So, would someone pop up the list onto the share screen so that we can run through it and assign our recommendations?
Why don't we start with Penny's group or Jennifer's, because they had a longer list.
Sure.
And a little bit of an overlap. So I think maybe that would be a good way to address.
Did I lose everybody? I don't hear anybody anymore.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, good. You know, sometimes Zoom land, that happens. Okay, so if we were to consider the recommendations on who or the many who should be responsible for the train the trainers concept.
Would that be an EPSB decision if it is for all ed prep programs?
I would think so.
I would consider it policy, so I would assume that would go through EPSB.
I think it could also be a strong recommendation for EPPs to consider on their own.
I was gonna say, what about CACT?
Yep. So KACTE.
Yes.
And let's see, recruiting, that statement's more on the priority, so we'll have that conversation here in a minute. Ideology of school staff, where does that recommendation live?
KDE oversees the SBDM trainings. They work with KASC. Sorry, Janae, we're giving you all kinds of acronyms, but yeah, KASC.
And you can probably copy and paste that one to also the diverse applicant pool, because they would be providing the guidance on making sure that those same SBDMs are getting that culturally responsive training as it applies to hiring and the like. Anyone else to add to that group?
I just had a question as to, in our group, we were talking about what happens with the data as to who's hired, who's retained, what's the reason for some of the reason that they might be leaving, or reasons that they don't want to stay, or where does that fit in here? I don't know if I heard that explicitly put anywhere, even though I know we talked about it.
Yeah, KDE has that data. They have the data, Vivian, on applicants, the applicants' race, ethnicity, gender, and then they have to submit who they hired. That's usually provided in an aggregate, and it used to be, I don't know if it still is, so I will have to check. It used to be in the school report card to show not only I know it shows the diversity of the teacher workforce, but it used to also show turnover, because that used to be a federal requirement.
Right, that's the question we had. Does it show that the folks that are exiting?
That's a good question. It's a good question. I would say KDE would have that data to know if it's still going. As far as the reason why they leave, that's typically at the district level, but Dr. Flynn, if I'm off on that one, please correct me, but I believe that's a district level on the exit.
So the ownership on that one would probably be both the district and the EPSB, right? So that districts could manage their own trends and set forth their own equity goals related to hiring practices.
Amanda, does KDE track non-renewals and reasonings behind that, or data of that nature?
No, not at the state level. That's at district level. It's just the postings and then when they're filled. That's typically what it is.
Thank you.
Yep. Mhm.
Okay, let's see, incentives and grant programs.
That's college, I think at the college level also, well, maybe not necessarily KDE, but definitely the districts.
The districts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know why that was so hard for me to say in real words, sorry.
And I will say that when you're looking at districts, the incentives really come from the districts. We don't have a
Yeah.
lot of abilities within the colleges, but what we can do is manage job fairs and make sure that there's a connection point to ensure that the opportunity has been presented to both district and teacher. And how about the transition for incoming pre-service teachers more welcomed as they enter into a full-time position? District?
I think so.
District induction?
Yeah, I think so. Unless we have situations in certain cities or counties where there's a partnership that's already in play with the university and the district, they'll have some hybrid form of that.
Yeah.
And just a question, do the educational cooperatives fit into any of these?
Yeah, so that's a great point. I know that a lot of the cooperatives, and again, Jim can speak to this probably even more so, especially in with all the correct that he works with, but all of them now, is that there a lot of them are offering their rank 2, and a lot of them have different teacher cadres. They have MAT programs. So Sherry, I think that's a great point. And they are looking for ways to meet the needs of their districts, because their districts are saying, we need teachers, like help us. And so I do think this is on the top of their list. They're very interested on, and some will say, have said to me, we're not sure how to do it or what to do, but we're in. And when we were doing equity, the equity labs, and looking at the environment, cultural scans, and achievement gaps, our co-ops were very much involved. So I don't know, Jim, if you want to add more to that, if Greg's doing anything additional that I'm not aware of, which is very possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great vehicle, especially to support some of this work, and even I was still kind of thinking about some of these, like who, and and I think districts are going to be an important partner in that, because the superintendents of those districts are who sits on those co-op boards, and that's who then will really get the attention of the educational cooperatives in terms of the kind of services they're delivering, so I would even thinking about the ideology of school staff and how the district and what they do plays in that part, the diverse applicant pools, and how HR and the districts, their role in that. But I think the real important key back to co-ops is, if the districts want it and see the need, then the co-ops will help support it, through their structure.
And I think the caveat onto what Jim had said too, what stands out in my mind, Janae, I'm really going to, Jennifer's typing, but a lot of K groups. So I think about, and KEA, like I think about KEA, Eddie, the efforts you all have made around recruitment and how you've been a part of Educators Rising and even national board. I think, Jim, about you guys on KASS and the influence you have on your district leaders, and KASA on their principal and leadership development, even around recruitment. So I just think about if there's a unified message or a professional learning piece, Penny, to your point, I think it even goes beyond just SBDMs, but different levels. So it's a common message, but how does it look through the lens of a principal? How does it look through the lens of a superintendent or an HR director? through teachers. I don't know, maybe that's just too messy and Corinne just shut me down. But I think about those K groups, and to me, that communication of a unified message is really powerful, especially around the recruitment of teachers and elevating the field at different levels.
And I think we had talked about maybe last week in the prep meeting was the idea that we would be using a variety of these different constituents to get feedback on the report that we're going to send. And we're going to do that with intentionality based off of interest. And so I do think that that lends itself that maybe the K groups can also share with us where they see themselves fitting into this work. So.
And I think right now is a really great time because superintendents are telling me this issue is getting harder and harder, for them. They, particularly in certain areas. And so I think the motivation will be really high to try to get on board with the, kind of a unified, shared, vision and plan, and how we can deploy this together. So I think the stars are lining up to help with that.
So we only have a couple of minutes, like 90 seconds left. So I think based off of what you all recommended on the assignments, we can probably transfer that to some of the work that we talked about with the recruiting portion of this. So if we could, let's turn it over to Jennifer for some closing comments, and then we'll send everybody on their way.
Sounds good. So we will continue to work on this and flesh this out and bring this back. As always, what a great group. We truly appreciate your input. Even though we did some heavy lifting, I'm going to task you with 2 questions that we want you to consider. And thinking about these recommendations that we've kind of prioritized, what require policy changes or implementation? And then also be thinking about what are existing programs, policies, or initiatives that you might be aware of from your perspective within the state or even otherwise that we might want to leverage really to address the priorities that we discussed today. So just be thinking about those 2 things for the next meeting. We'll definitely do more of a deep dive into those questions in July. But I want to leave you with this. In the meantime, just as a reminder, as Dean Murphy said, our full continuum does meet next week. Again, crazy timeline, but Wednesday, June 23rd. If anyone's not a member on the continuum, it is live streamed if you want to watch it. It's again next Wednesday at 1 p.m. It'll be on the CPE webpage, and you can certainly view it via YouTube. But it'll be during this time that we lift up these priorities that we shared today in the full continuum for the consideration. So likely what'll happen is the continuum, based on all these priorities from the 3 different work groups, will continue to narrow those down. And so we'll have some more information to share based on those conversations, which leads me to our next work group meeting. It's Thursday, July 15th. So make sure you've got your calendars marked. It's 10 a.m. Eastern time. And again, as always, we'll be sure to share any notes or resources in our Google folder. If you don't have access to that, please just feel free to reach out. And again, thank you again for everyone's engagement and participation, especially, I know it's in the middle of June, so we truly appreciate everyone. Hope everyone has a great week, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.